Hey everyone, I just woke up, so I am trying to get this done before you guys have your morning meeting with me. I'm so excited to see you today and tell you what I've read this weekend, but I'm gonna have some tea first. If you would like to have some tea while we read this section of the book, you can do that too. I prefer green tea with soy milk, but yeah, you guys should give it a try. And we are going to read Peppermints in the Parlor, chapter 9, which is called An Unexpected Invitation. And if I believe, this could be the chapter that features tea. However, it could have been, I don't know. We'll see. Let's just read, you guys. Chapter 9, An Unexpected Invitation. Emily pushed open the kitchen door and peered stealthily across the dining room. Tock, tock, tock. Only the face of the grandfather clock, tolling its mournful tale, was there to look down on her. Still she hesitated. She had long since begun to wish that Kipper had gone on to scratching his ears until he had concluded that he would not allow her to take the fish syrup around to the old people. Having an exciting idea when talking with Kipper in the comparative safety of the laundry room was one thing, but carrying it on, all on her own, in the shadows of Sugar Hill Hall was another. She would not, however, stand there waiting forever. Her heart longed somewhere near her throat. She ran on tiptoes across the dining room. Then she peeked cautiously into the parlor. Even with the syrup bottle well hidden under the rags in her bucket, she was relieved to find that no one was there except for a few old people staring across the room with unseen eyes. She scurried past the Peppermints and started up the stairs. She had gone no more than 3 steps, however, when she heard the sound of heavy boots stomping down to the landing. She looked up with a start, expecting to see Tilly. Instead, she saw a man wearing an extraordinarily untidy sea captain's uniform coming directly towards her. His face had not had the attention of a razor in some days, and was as ugly a face as Emily had ever seen. Through a mat of coarse stubble, a bulbous nose, decorated by a wart large and black as a fly, swelled out over thick, rubbery lips. A scarlet gash peered from one cheek to chin to ear. Emily stared at the sea captain with fixed eyes, and he stared back. She felt as if he was suddenly covered with a sheet of ice. Who was this ugly horror of a man? What was he doing at Sugar Hill Hall? What might he do to her right then? His eyes seemed to drill a hole right through the bucket to the bottle of fish syrup. But whatever his business there, it had nothing to do with Emily. He simply brushed right past her with only a twitch of a squinted, bloodshot eye. The grandfather clock must have ticked away a whole minute before Emily was able to move again. Still trembling, she hurried on up the stairs, with eyes intently fastened on her feet, lest she stumble and drop the bucket. She was all the way to the head of her own stairs before she saw Mrs. Plumley standing in her doorway, watching. "Oh," Emily gasped. "My dear child," explained Miss Plumley. It was the first time Emily had heard her voice, and it was sweet and musical, matching Mrs. Plumley perfectly. "I'm so sorry. Did I frighten you?" "No," stammered Emily. "I was only startled." "But you do look so pale, my dear. Did something else alarm you?" Mrs. Plumley looked alarmed herself. Her round face was puckered up in a whole map of pink wrinkles. Emily nodded. A sea captain coming down the stairs. He was ugly and horrible looking." "Sea captain? Ugly?" Mrs. Plumley looked puzzled. Then suddenly her eyebrow raised. "Ah, I think I know the person you mean. Now, what could he have been doing, prowling about Sugar Hill Hall?" "We can't have this. I must speak to Miss Meaching about it. But not yet, child. I've been wanting very much to speak with you. Wait." Miss Plumley held up a warning finger, then tiptoed to the banister and looked into the mirror that reflected the parlor below. Quickly she tiptoed back and beckoned Emily into her room. "Come, it's safe now. Come into my room, dear child." Emily was so surprised and overwhelmed by this unexpected invitation that she could hardly put one foot in front of the other. As soon as she entered into the cozy room, Miss Plumley swiftly closed the door behind her. "Oh, my dear child, I have wanted so much to speak with you. I have been so lonely for the sound of a young voice. As you can see, all I have now is my pictures and my memories." She looked sadly toward all the photographs on the walls. "But please do sit down for just a moment." Still unable to believe that she was actually in this delightful room with Miss Plumley, Emily set down her bucket and seated herself on a small walnut rocker beside the fireplace. A tea kettle sang softly over the glowing coals, and before it a silver dish of tiny cakes lay temptingly on a low table. Mrs. Plumley settled down as soft as Christmas pudding into a pale green velvet armchair across the table. "Now please do help yourself to some cake," she said in her melodious voice, smiling at Emily. Emily could have easily taken a handful of the luscious little cakes. She felt so empty. The fish syrup had gone down smoothly, just as Kipper had predicted it would, but she had not been taking it long enough for it to have much effect when she faced the morning menu of tasteless gruel. Good manners, however, stood in the way of present hunger. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Plumley," she said, and took one small cherry cream tart. "Oh, my sweet child," Miss Plumley said quickly, "please have another. You must be so hungry. And please, too, won't you call me Auntie Plum when we are alone together? It would mean so much to me." "Yes, Auntie Plum," Emily said shyly. "That's so much better." Miss Plumley smiled again. Then her face faded suddenly. She jumped up from her chair and ran to the door, her yellow-flowered skirt whooping anxiously across the floor. She stood for a few minutes when her ear pressed to the door before returning to collapse in her seat. Her face was stiff with fear. "It's all right, child," she said, breathing heavily. "There's no one there. I didn't mean to alarm you." "Oh, Auntie Plum, are you... Emily could not go. "Speak, child," said Mrs. Plumley urgently. "What is it you wish to say?" "Aunt Plumley, are you a prisoner of Sugar Hill Hall too, like Aunt Twice?" Mrs. Plumley nodded stiffly. "Yes, dear, I am too a prisoner." Her eyes swam with tears. "Only I, thanks to someone else's kindness, am more fortunate than the other sad inmates of this mansion." "Thanks to someone's kindness?" Emily drew in a sharp breath. "Auntie Plum, are you the one whose life depends on Aunt Twice?" She blurted it out before she could stop herself. Mrs. Plum looked as if she had turned to stone. Did your Aunt Twice mention any name?" "No," stammered Emily, thoroughly frightened. "She would not tell me." Mrs. Plumley's soft gray eyes now burned with a terrible fear. "Please, child, ask no more questions of your aunt or me." She looked over her shoulder with a deep shudder. "The walls here have eyes and ears." The eyes and ears of Sugar Hill Hall again. Whose? Thought Emily, trembling. "Now, I'm afraid you must leave, dear Emily," Mrs. Plumley said, collecting herself. "I've kept you here too long. But before you go, please promise to do two things. One is that you will be very, very careful. The other is that you will return again sometime to see me." "I promise both," Emily said earnestly, and then they parted. But as she carried her bucket up the stairs, more questions plummeted through her mind. There was one question, however, that she no longer needed to ask anyone, for Emily now knew, as surely as she knew how night followed day, that Mrs. Plumley was the one Aunt Twice was protecting. But that answer only served to open up a new question. Why? All right. I'm going to take a quick sip of my tea. I wish the chapter ended there because that would be a good cliffhanger, but it does not, so we'll read more in a second. I'm curious what you guys think. Why do you think Aunt Twice is protecting Miss Plumley? And do you think that's the person? Do you agree with Emily's conclusion? Kipper marched up the cellar laundry room, carrying two paper sacks in his hands. He set them both down carefully on the stone floor and began to unwrap his green and white striped muffler. "Well, did you do it?" His eyes were bluer than ever with suppressed excitement. "I did." Emily smiled up at him from her washboard. "Dingus, Emily, did you have any trouble? I mean, you didn't get seen or anything." As he talked, Kipper was already rolling up his sleeves, prepared to help with the wash. He dropped to his knees before a second tub. Tilly had thoughtfully placed there as soon as she learned that he was willing to offer his services free of charge. Well, Emily said. She hardly knew where to begin. Oh, Kipper, I have so much to tell you. Then best start telling, said Kipper with a cheerful grin. But before Emily had finished her story, the grin had long since faded and been replaced by a thoughtful, somber expression. Sounds mighty like you're right about Miss Plumley being the one your aunt is protecting. And if that's so, it makes for lots of more questions. I know, Emily said, and I don't like any of them, Kipper. Her voice broke. Now see here, don't you go doing any more of them supposings about your uncle twice, Emily. Ain't nothing definite about anything. Come on, he said with a reassuring bob of his head. Tell me about that sea captain. You said he had a nasty wart atop his nose and a red cut going all the way from his chin to his ear. Emily nodded. Well, you know, it ain't exact description of Captain Skurlock. I'll eat a live eel, as Pa always says. Don't know him personal, Kipper replied. Just know that he's a mighty nasty individual. That's what he says, individual. Him and his wicked crew. Miss Plumley's right not to want what he likes him prowling around Sugar Hill Hall. Wonder what he was up to. I ain't seen him but once or twice inside here as I can recollect, and then only having a word with the snake lady at the front door. But see here, we never got round to talking about fish syrup. You never did tell Mrs. Plumley about it, did you? He asked anxiously. Emily shook her head. Good. Best not to tell anyone about it, Emily. Not anyone. I won't, Emily promised. I don't think we should either. But you never did say, Kipper continued, do the old ones take to the fish syrup? Oh, yes, said Emily. They take it like lambs, the ones I can give it to without being seen. But Kipper, they just open their mouths for the syrup like babies who have grown very old without ever learning to speak or smile. I wonder now if I'll ever be able to help them. Ain't anybody's appetite growing bigger? Kipper asked. Well, some of them do finish their soup now, as I'm beginning to, but they won't touch the bread. Until they do, you know Mrs. Meaching won't get them any fresh. Give 'em time, said Kipper. Anyways, I brought some more syrup. Oh, good. Emily clapped her hands. I doubt there's a spoonful left in the bottle. It is in those bags you brought? It is in one of them, Kipper replied carelessly. How about you go over to find what's in the other? Emily looked at him curiously, and then he became suddenly intent on scrubbing a piece of linen with his washboard. She quickly wiped her hands on her draggled dress and ran over to the sacks. Dropping to her knees, she carefully opened one little sack and lifted out 3 large bottles of fish syrup. But when she started to open the second sack, she heard an odd little squeak coming from inside of it. She looked at Kipper with surprise and looked inside the sack and threw her hands to her mouth. Oh, a kitten! A little calico kitten. Where did it come from and who's it for? Come from Pa and my Blackie, said Kipper, beaming from ear to ear. And it's for you. I've been busting to tell you. I was afraid I'd wake up and spoil my surprise. It would wake up and spoil my surprise. A kitten, breathed Emily, lifting it carefully from the sack. But where will I keep it and how will I feed it? Feeding's easy. That's Pa's fish business. As for keeping it, well, I guess how Pa and me'll have to keep it, but I'll bring it to you from time to time so you can play with it, Emily. Emily set the kitten down on the floor. Just as she did, a drop of water flew out from Kipper's tub and splashed onto its nose. Startled, the kitten arched its back and pranced against the floor. Emily giggled. Then she held out her hand and the kitten came to sniff at it. Assured out of its safety, the kitten suddenly rolled over onto its back so nothing could be seen but its soft white chest, which looked to Emily exactly like Mama's lamb wool powder puff that she had once loved to play with. Oh, Kipper, she breathed. If only I could keep it just for tonight. Could I? Afraid not, Emily. Kipper shook his head firmly. Too much danger. Anyway, where would you keep it? Emily thought for a moment. There's a tiny room up from mine that's not locked because there's nothing in it. Tilly never had a need to go there, and neither does Aunt Twice. Well, please, Kipper, only for one night. I won't ask for any more. But I ain't coming back tomorrow, Emily. I ain't going to be here till the day after to deliver the fish. 2 nights aren't more dangerous than 1. Please say you'll leave it, Emily pleaded. Well, Kipper said uncertainly, I guess it would be all right. I've brought enough fish and a bit of milk, but no more than 2 nights. Oh, Kipper, Emily whispered, stroking the kitten's velvety ears. If only I could take it around for the old people to see. Kipper's head jerked up so suddenly he almost toppled over. Oh, no, he said sternly. Oh, no, Miss Emily, none of that. I ain't going to have anything left but gray hair time you get back here with all that dangerous notion. There's no taking the kitten out of this cellar. But I take the fish syrup around. Why is it that I can't take the fish, that I can take the fish syrup if I can't take the kitten? 'Cause, said Kipper fiercely, fish syrup don't mew, Emily. Oh, said Emily meekly. All right, chapter 10 is called Mrs. Poovy and Mrs. Loops, and we'll read that later. I will see you guys soon. Bye.